Before we formally introduce Thomas Cronin's idea of the paradoxes of the presidency, let's take a look at some of the previous theories that have been put forward to understand what the presidency is and what sort of powers and limitations on those powers the president has. And most of those have generally tended to be too simplistic, or they have really emphasized to a large extent the actual personality of the president who's in office. And so we'll talk about those both separately. So, first of all, the idea that the theories that have been developed have been too simplistic. Generally speaking, you find that with time, people have come up with the clever bumper sticker that explains what the president was and the type of president that we had over a certain period of time. And so what we had was the all powerful, benevolent institution of the 1950s. Everyone likes Ike. I like Ike. The idea that the presidency, particularly after World War II, and a president that was one who led the United States to victory in World War II, dominated the idea of what the presidency was and did in the 1950s. You had the imperial presidency of the 1960s. You had John F. Kennedy coming in, the idea of Camelot, but then he gets assassinated, and Lyndon Baines Johnson takes over and is able to, in a tumultuous period with the Vietnam War and with other ideas of civil rights and unrest leading to some uncertainties. People argue that there was an imperial presidency of the 1960s. That led to the imperiled presidency of the 1970s because of Watergate. And after the Watergate scandal, there were severe limitations were placed on the President of the United States because they didn't want the same sort of things to happen again that Nixon was able to get away with. So each one of these can be helpful, but they tend to oversimplify the competing forces that were actually going on there at the time. And as you experience them and as you think about going forward, maybe the storyline will make sense, decades from now. But in the moment, there are actually quite a few competing forces, and it wasn't entirely clear that everything in the 1970s was imperiled. Not everything was imperial in the 1960s. Not everything was all powerful and benevolent in the 1950s. And so when we put that overarching idea, it only helps us sort of historically looking back on it. The other type of theories that are out there are ones that tend to be driven by personality of the individual in the office. And that does make a lot of sense. The president is an individual, and it clearly is, despite some of the arguments made particularly by third-party candidates. In the 2000 election, Ralph Nader was running for the Green Party, and he was arguing in a self-serving way that there really wasn't any difference between Al Gore and George W. Bush. It was to have the president as President Bush when 9/11 happened. I'm not going so far as to say that if we had President Gore, 9/11 wouldn't have happened and there wouldn't have been attempted terrorist attacks, but the response to those terrorist attacks would have been very different if you had Al Gore as opposed to George W. Bush. And so this idea of the personality of the individual who's in office matters quite a bit. It is important that the current president we have, like we sometimes are contradictory, they're ones that are self-serving and are narcissistic, or all these different things. And certainly characteristics of this president influences the dynamics of the choices he makes, the way in which he reacts to different policies and different crises, some of which he creates himself. So the personality does matter, but it is one that sometimes we can look at too much and forget about the institutional constraints that do exist on all presidents. And so what I'm looking to for us to understand this is Thomas Cronin's idea of the paradoxes of the presidency. We'll talk about the paradoxes in the next part of this lecture, but for now, what we want to talk about is this idea of the paradox. And the set of paradoxes is the conclusion that Thomas Cronin reaches is he says, look, the things that he lists, and we're not going to do all of them, we're going to just take it to a select few, but the number of paradoxes that he identifies in all presidents is what he says is an invitation to failure. That's not something I want to get invited to. A birthday party, sure, but an invitation to failure? You come to my failure, it's going to be fun. So clearly the idea of an invitation to failure is an indication that there is an expectation of, this won't go well, which is a problem. If the President of the United States is a key part of our political system, which he is, and if in fact is also important for the world and world politics, this is a problem, that there is something systematic that leads to the possibility of failure, is something that is a bit concerning. That failure is not inevitable, but it's certainly not easy to overcome. He takes very seriously all the constraints these paradoxes create for all individuals who are in the office of the presidency, and says that it's not necessarily that we're going to have failure, but it is pretty likely, and we should expect that to be possible. In fact, the solution points out that it is one of these solutions that is, when you hear it, is both perhaps true, but also not all that comforting. And the solution is, and we shall have to select as presidents a person who understands these contrary demands and who has the gift of improvisation that these paradoxes demand. And that I put in italics on there is this gift of improvisation. And so what we need to think about is, have we chosen in the presidents who we have selected, have we chosen them because of their gift of improvisation? Does Trump have a gift of improvisation? Did Obama have it? Did Bush have it? Did Clinton? Did Bush? Did Reagan? And so in that, it helps us understand and think about the choices that were made in the past. But it is also one in which we can use it in the present and in the future to think about, for example, are the Democrats, in terms of how they're deciding who their nominee is going to be, is the Democratic Party really of identifying the individuals who have this gift of improvisation? Or is it that we're going about it in the wrong way, that we don't encourage this gift of improvisation, or the system is set up in such a way as those with the gift of improvisation may not be successful in all the different debates, all the different small town hall meetings in Iowa and South Carolina, and the flipping of pancakes and all of those things? Is that an indication of the gift of improvisation, or is it asking our candidates to do something that doesn't necessarily help us identify who is the person who is best able to have this gift of improvisation that is necessary to negotiate victory paradoxes? And even more structurally is this idea of, does the way we select presidents encourage these innovative people to run? If you get elected president, it's a two-stage process. First, you must win the primary for your political party. Once you have the nomination of that political party, then you need to win the general election. And the people who vote in the primaries are very different than the people who vote in the general election. The people who vote in the primaries tend to be much more extreme, more tied to their party and their partisanship. Whereas people in the center, people in the general election, more are centrist. They are not ones who are necessarily tied to the Democratic ideas or the Republican ideas. Instead, what they want is someone who has this improvisation to be able to solve these complicated issues that are out there. And so in many ways, the promises that are made during the primaries may change when they get to the general election. And so then we have to ask, which president are we electing? The one who had a certain position in the primaries, or the one who in the general election is saying certain things? And so that makes it hard for us to hold them accountable if in fact they're doing some institutional flip-flopping in terms of the positions they take during the different ones during the general elections. Furthermore, the Electoral College is a way in which we actually constitutionally choose the President of the United States. And the way in which you win the Electoral College is to put together a coalition of states that give you 270 or more Electoral College votes. That's how you get elected President of the United States. But that means promising, and probably over-promising, to a bunch of different groups. The idea of pluralism comes to play. And so in order to win all of these different states, you need to come up with policies that are going to placate certain states so that they're like, yeah, I want to vote for this candidate. Can the president actually fulfill all the promises that they made? And if not, what does that then say about this process of elections being promises that we need to hold the candidates accountable for? The theory that Thomas Cronin comes up with in identifying these paradoxes and saying that these paradoxes create an invitation to failure. It's not inevitable, but it is a pretty high percentage chance that this is not going to go well, is a depressing theory, but it might be one that helps us illuminate dynamics that face all individuals become President of the United States.